Victor Marchesi stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Metropolitan Art Museum, his presence commanding attention despite the tailored suit designed to help him blend with politicians and philanthropists. The charity gala hummed with carefully orchestrated elegance around him, crystal glasses catching light from chandeliers that had witnessed a century of wealth-changing hands. He'd accepted this invitation not from generosity but calculation, knowing the city's power brokers would gather here tonight, their guards down among Renaissance paintings and marble sculptures. His daughter walked beside him, her small hand tucked in his, her eyes wide at the opulence that had become ordinary in their world. This was education of a different kind, teaching her to navigate spaces where influence mattered more than muscle. Victor had built his empire through strategy rather than violence, understanding that true power came from knowing which strings to pull and when to remain invisible behind legitimate fronts. In a smaller gallery adjacent to the main exhibition hall, Emma sat cross-legged on the polished floor with her sketchpad balanced on her knees, charcoal smudging her fingertips as she captured faces through the glass partition. The museum's educational outreach program had given her access to this world she'd only seen in donated books at the group home. Her drawings weren't the simple stick figures most 8-year-olds produced, but carefully observed portraits that caught something essential about her subjects. Tonight's event had brought more interesting faces than usual. Men in expensive watches who moved like dancers, women whose laughter sounded rehearsed. She'd filled 3 pages already, but the tall man with the little girl kept drawing her attention back, something in his careful watchfulness matching her own. Emma absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone storing memories against an uncertain future, her pencil moving across paper with surprising precision. Sophia Raines moved through the crowd with a tablet in hand, checking that the educational displays were positioned correctly and that the young participants from the outreach program felt welcomed rather than overwhelmed. She'd built this initiative from nothing over 5 years, convincing the museum board that art belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford exclusive galas. Her dress was simple compared to the designer gowns surrounding her, but she wore it with confidence that came from knowing her value wasn't measured in silk. When she glanced toward the children's area, she spotted Emma in her usual corner, the girl who never sought attention but missed nothing. Sophia made a mental note to check on her soon, though Emma rarely needed supervision, just space to observe and create. The child had a gift for seeing what others overlooked, translating observation into art that sometimes made adults uncomfortable with its accuracy. The museum director clinked a fork against crystal to gather attention, his voice carrying across the exhibition hall as he began the evening's formal remarks about preservation and cultural legacy. Victor only half listened, his focus split between his daughter's safety and the various players in the room, recognizing faces from both legitimate business and the underworld. Tonight was reconnaissance wrapped in philanthropy, opportunities disguised as small talk near impressionist paintings. His daughter tugged his hand, pointing at a sculpture she found particularly interesting, and he bent to hear her whispered observation about how the bronze seemed to capture movement. The innocence in her voice reminded him why he'd worked so hard to keep certain parts of his world separate from her existence. She deserved museums and art, not the violence that had built the fortune funding their presence here tonight. The curator's presentation droned on about provenance and artistic techniques, while guests shifted their weight and calculated how long before they could politely drift toward refreshment tables. Emma had stopped drawing, her attention caught by something she couldn't quite identify, a wrongness in the pattern of movement she'd been tracking. A man she'd sketched earlier stood too close to one of the restricted doorways, his posture casual, but his eyes scanning with purpose. She started a new drawing, her hand moving quickly to capture his features before he moved again, the angle of his jaw and the particular way he wore his security badge. Something about him made her stomach tighten, though she couldn't have explained why to an adult, just an instinct that told her to pay attention. Her charcoal pressed harder against paper, darkening the lines around his eyes, catching the tension in his shoulders that didn't match the relaxed gathering. Victor's phone buzzed silently in his pocket, a message from one of his men stationed outside, confirming that all exit points remained secure and unremarkable. He'd learned long ago that safety required layers of awareness, never trusting a single system or perspective when his family's well-being hung in the balance. The gala represented controlled risk, public enough that open conflict was impossible but exclusive enough that screening had meaning. The formal presentation concluded with polite applause, and the crowd began flowing toward the adjoining galleries where hors d'oeuvres were arranged on tables draped in white linen. Victor kept his daughter close as they moved through the throng, nodding at acquaintances while maintaining the careful distance that came naturally. He noticed the museum's head of security positioned near the Renaissance wing, a man whose military background showed in his posture and scanning eyes. Sophia approached the children's area, smiling at the few young artists who'd been granted access through the outreach program as their guardians mingled with the wealthy patrons. Emma looked up from her sketch pad, her expression serious in a way that seemed too old for her years. The educator had learned to read that look, knowing it meant the girl had noticed something worth attention, though getting her to articulate observations could take patience. The host of the evening, Charles Hammond, separated from a conversation with city council members and made his way toward the eastern galleries where his daughter had been admiring medieval tapestries. His wife had stayed home with a headache, leaving him to manage both the social obligations and their 9-year-old, who'd begged to attend after learning about the illuminated manuscripts. He checked his watch, calculating another hour before he could reasonably extract them both from the obligations of wealth. Victor accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, though he had no intention of drinking it, the prop simply part of the costume required for these gatherings. His daughter had wandered a few feet away, drawn to a display case containing ancient coins, her face pressed close to the glass. He watched her with an expression that might have surprised those who knew him only through reputation, the hardness in his features softening into something approaching tenderness. Emma gathered her drawings, stacking them carefully, though one sketch remained unfinished, the man with the security badge still lacking the background details she usually included. Sophia crouched beside her, asking gentle questions about the evening and whether she'd enjoyed seeing the gala from this unique perspective. The girl nodded, but kept glancing toward the main hall, that same wrongness pulling at her attention like a thread she couldn't quite grasp. The museum hummed with conversation and the clink of glasses, hundreds of voices blending into a sound that felt like wealth itself made audible. Servers circulated with precision, security personnel maintained discreet positions, and the city's elite performed the ritual of charitable giving that kept their names on plaques and their consciences temporarily eased. Nobody noticed when Charles Hammond's daughter slipped away from the tapestries, following what she thought was her father's voice calling from a corridor marked "Staff Only." 20 minutes passed before Charles realized his daughter wasn't where he'd left her admiring the medieval textiles, his initial assumption of wandering replaced by concern when a quick search of adjacent galleries turned up nothing. He approached the nearest security guard with practiced calm, describing his daughter and asking if she'd been seen heading toward the restrooms. The guard spoke into his radio, his expression neutral, but his hand moving to his hip in a gesture that suggested training kicking in. Victor noticed the shift in energy before most guests registered anything wrong, years of reading rooms and sensing danger making him alert to the subtle tension spreading through security personnel. His daughter stood beside him, oblivious, still studying the ancient coins while he watched guards taking positions near exits without causing alarm. Something had happened, though the facade of normalcy held, champagne still flowing and conversations continuing among those who hadn't yet picked up on the undercurrent. Sophia saw Charles Hammond speaking urgently to the head of security, his composed exterior cracking enough that she recognized genuine fear beneath the practiced social veneer. She moved closer, her educator's instinct for crisis management activating even as she hoped this was simple confusion rather than something worse. The security chief was already pulling up camera feeds on a tablet, his jaw tight as he reviewed footage from the eastern galleries. Emma stood abruptly from her corner, her sketch pad falling to the floor as she moved toward the glass partition separating her area from the main hall. Something in her expression caught Sophia's attention, a certainty that seemed odd for a child who couldn't possibly know what the adults were discussing. The girl pressed her palm against the glass, her eyes tracking movement through the crowd with intensity that made the educator's stomach clench. The museum director appeared beside Charles, his public smile fixed in place even as he spoke in low tones about protocols and procedures designed for exactly this situation. Exits were being monitored, staff were conducting systematic searches of public areas, and the gala would continue as normal to prevent panic while they located his daughter. Charles nodded mechanically, his mind clearly racing through scenarios no parent wanted to entertain, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Victor handed his champagne glass to a passing server and placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder, drawing her closer without explanation. She looked up at him with questions forming, but he shook his head slightly, the gesture carrying weight she'd learned to respect. He scanned the room with renewed focus, cataloging faces and positions, his mind shifting from social navigation to tactical assessment in the space between heartbeats. The head of security reviewed camera footage from the past 30 minutes, his finger pausing on a timestamp showing the girl near the tapestries. Then nothing. No exit from that gallery was captured on any camera. No sign of her moving toward public areas or restricted zones. The blind spots in coverage were known and documented, but they shouldn't have allowed a child to simply vanish without someone noticing her passage through monitored spaces. Sophia made her way to Emma, kneeling beside the girl and speaking softly about what she'd observed from her vantage point near the glass. The child didn't respond immediately, her attention still fixed on something in the main hall, tracking movement that the educator couldn't identify. When Emma finally turned, her eyes held that serious expression again, and she reached for Sophia's hand with surprising urgency. Guards began moving through the crowd more obviously now, some guests starting to notice the increased activity and whispering questions to each other. The museum director intercepted concerns with practiced ease, speaking of routine security checks and nothing to worry about, while his eyes betrayed calculations about reputation and liability. Charles stood frozen near the Renaissance wing, his composure completely shattered as the reality of his daughter's disappearance settled over him like ice. Victor observed the security response with professional assessment, noting gaps in their coverage and weaknesses in their protocols that any experienced operative would exploit. He kept these observations to himself, maintaining his role as concerned guest, rather than revealing expertise that would raise questions about his background. His daughter pressed against his side, sensing the tension even if she couldn't articulate its source, her small hand gripping his jacket. Emma pulled Sophia toward the main hall, pointing at her sketchpad still lying on the floor where she'd dropped it. The educator retrieved it, flipping through pages of portraits and scenes from the evening, until Emma stopped her on the unfinished drawing of the man with the security badge. The girl's finger tapped the paper insistently, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke, saying she'd seen him near the corridor where the tapestries were displayed. The museum's communication system crackled to life with coded messages that meant nothing to guests but sent staff members moving toward predetermined positions throughout the building. Public exits were being subtly monitored, restricted areas were being locked down, and the gala was transforming from social event into controlled environment. Most attendees remained unaware, their conversations continuing around canapes and champagne, insulated by wealth from understanding when danger moved among them. Sophia studied Emma's drawing with growing unease, recognizing the uniform of museum security, but not the specific individual the girl had captured with such detail. She looked toward the main hall, trying to spot the man among the various guards now stationed throughout the space. Emma tugged her hand again, shaking her head and pointing toward the eastern galleries, indicating he'd moved away from public view. Victor made a decision that went against his instinct to remain invisible, approaching Charles Hammond with the directness of someone accustomed to command rather than request. He introduced himself with name only, no title or explanation, and asked what security had found on their camera review. Charles looked at him with the confusion of someone too overwhelmed to question why a stranger was inserting himself into a crisis, and the security chief standing nearby started to object before something in Victor's presence made him pause. The two men shared a look that transcended social class and legal boundaries, recognition passing between them that they understood similar worlds, even if they'd never crossed paths before. The security chief pulled up the footage again, showing Victor the timeline of the girl's disappearance and the inexplicable gap in coverage. Victor studied the screen with trained eyes, noting details the other man had missed, angles that didn't make sense if you assumed incompetence rather than intention. Sophia appeared beside them with Emma in tow, the girl clutching her sketchpad against her chest like armor. The adults turned toward this interruption with varying degrees of impatience until Emma held out her drawing of the man with the security badge. Charles stared at the portrait, his face draining of color, as he recognized features that belonged to someone on his personal security team, a man he'd trusted with his family's safety for 3 years. The museum's grand hall seemed to contract around them as Charles reached for the sketchpad with trembling hands, his fingers tracing the charcoal lines that captured a face he'd seen hundreds of times without really looking. Victor watched the man's reaction with clinical detachment, already calculating implications and connections, while others were still processing shock. Emma stood perfectly still, her small frame radiating certainty that came from observation rather than accusation, simply presenting what she'd seen without understanding its full weight. Sophia kept a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, suddenly aware they'd crossed from social event into something far more dangerous, though the surrounding gala continued its oblivious celebration. The security chief grabbed his radio and began issuing orders to locate the man in Emma's drawing, his voice tight with controlled fury at the betrayal. Guards throughout the museum received the description, their casual monitoring shifting to active hunting without most guests registering the change in tenor. Victor studied Emma with new interest, recognizing in her stillness and watchful eyes something he'd seen in operatives trained to gather intelligence without being noticed. She wasn't frightened by the adult tension surrounding her, just patient, waiting for them to understand what she'd already processed. He crouched to her eye level, his movement deliberate and non-threatening, and asked in a voice stripped of condescension what else she'd observed about the man in her drawing. Emma met his gaze without flinching, seeing something in this stranger that told her he'd actually listen, rather than dismiss a child's perspective. She described how the man had stood near the tapestry gallery entrance for 7 minutes, checking his watch 3 times while appearing to scan for threats. His attention kept returning to the corridor marked, "Staff only," and once he'd touched his ear in a gesture that suggested communication equipment, though none was visible. The details poured out in Emma's quiet voice, observations that trained security had missed because they were watching for external threats, rather than internal betrayal. She'd noticed his badge was clipped differently than other guards, the laminate facing outward where most wore theirs with the photo visible. His shoes were wrong too, expensive leather rather than the practical footwear security typically chose. Small details that individually meant nothing but together painted a picture of someone playing a role. Sophia listened with growing amazement at the depth of what this 8-year-old had cataloged, her educator's understanding of child development colliding with evidence that Emma processed her environment at a level far beyond typical. Victor nodded as the girl spoke, asking clarifying questions that revealed he understood the significance of each observation. Charles stood frozen, his world rearranging around the realization that his daughter had been taken not by a stranger, but by someone he'd welcomed into his home. The security chief was already pulling employment records on his tablet, his face darkening as he reviewed the file of the man Emma had drawn. 3 years of spotless service, background checks that had revealed nothing concerning, recommendations from previous positions that all checked out on surface examination. But Victor saw what the other man was discovering in real time, the kind of perfect record that came from careful construction, rather than genuine history, small inconsistencies that only became visible when you knew to look for them. Emma pulled another drawing from her sketch pad, this one showing the same man from a different angle, captured earlier in the evening when he'd been speaking with someone near the museum's service entrance. The second figure was only partially visible, mostly shadow and suggestion, but Emma had caught enough detail to show expensive clothing beneath a casual coat. Victor felt pieces clicking into place, the architecture of a plan that had been weeks or months in development becoming visible through a child's observant eyes. Sophia asked gently if Emma had seen where the man went after standing near the tapestry gallery, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The girl shook her head but pointed toward her sketch pad again, flipping to a page that showed the corridor layout as seen through the glass partition. She'd drawn the staff-only door slightly ajar, something she couldn't have invented because that detail wouldn't have been visible from the public galleries. Victor stood and turned to the security chief with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions in crisis, suggesting they seal the museum completely and begin systematic searches of restricted areas rather than public spaces. Charles found his voice again, demanding to know who this stranger was and why he should listen to someone who'd appeared from nowhere with unsolicited tactical advice. The security chief raised a hand to forestall argument, recognizing in Victor the same professional competence he'd developed through years of military service, understanding that credentials mattered less than capability when seconds counted. The museum director appeared again, his concern shifting from reputation management to genuine alarm as he grasped that this wasn't a simple case of a wandering child. He authorized lockdown protocols that would effectively trap everyone inside until the situation resolved, accepting the public relations nightmare in exchange for certainty that nothing could leave the building. Guests were beginning to notice now, conversations faltering as they registered guards blocking exits and staff members moving with urgent purpose. Emma tugged Sophia's hand again, pointing not toward the eastern galleries where the girl had vanished, but toward the northern wing where medieval manuscripts were displayed in climate-controlled cases. Victor followed her gesture, seeing what the adults had missed in their focus on the obvious search areas. The child was tracking not where people looked, but where they didn't, understanding instinctively that whoever had planned this would exploit exactly that blind spot in collective attention. Sophia made a decision that went against every protective instinct. choosing to trust Emma's observations over adult assumptions about where a child could or couldn't be taken. She spoke quietly to Victor, suggesting they follow Emma's lead while official security conducted their systematic search. Charles overheard and insisted on joining them, his need to do something overriding caution. His hand still shaking but his jaw set with determination that came from desperation rather than training. Victor assessed the group forming around him: a traumatized father, a protective educator, and a child whose observational skills rivaled trained intelligence operatives, and made calculations about whether this improvised team could accomplish what formal security might miss. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed agreement and acceptance of leadership in equal measure. Emma started walking toward the northern wing without waiting for further discussion, her small form moving through the crowd with purpose that made adults step aside without conscious thought. The gala had transformed completely now, music stopping and conversations dying as guests registered they were being contained rather than protected. Some pulled out phones to call lawyers or assistants. Others demanded explanations from staff members who had no answers to give. Victor kept his daughter close, handing her to one of the museum coordinators with quiet instructions to stay in public view until he returned, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable despite her protests. Sophia led Emma through galleries filled with increasingly anxious, wealthy patrons, the girl's hand firmly in hers as they navigated toward the medieval manuscript wing. Victor and Charles followed 3 steps behind, 2 men from completely different worlds united by the terror of children in danger. The northern corridor stretched before them, dimly lit to protect sensitive documents, lined with display cases that cast strange shadows in the emergency lighting that had activated when the lockdown began. Emma stopped at the entrance to the manuscript wing, her head tilting as she listened to something the adults couldn't hear, or perhaps felt vibrations through the floor that their heavier footsteps masked. Sophia waited beside her, trusting the girl's instincts even as rational thought screamed this was madness, following a child through a locked museum in search of another missing girl. Victor positioned himself slightly ahead, his body language shifting into something harder, more predatory, the businessman facade dropping away to reveal the operator underneath. Charles struggled to maintain composure, his breathing ragged as panic warred with the desperate need to believe his daughter was still safe somewhere in this building. He'd built his fortune through calculated risks and careful planning, but none of that prepared him for the helplessness of having his child taken while he stood 20 feet away discussing art acquisitions. Victor glanced back at him once, a look that conveyed both understanding and warning. Emotion would get them killed if this situation went the direction his instincts suggested. The manuscript wing's climate control hummed with steady precision, maintaining temperature and humidity that preserved documents centuries old, while the human drama unfolded around them. Emma moved between display cases with certainty, her small figure casting elongated shadows that danced across glass and parchment. She stopped at a case containing illuminated texts from medieval monasteries, her finger pressing against the glass near a section where the seal looked different from the others, almost imperceptibly newer. Sophia noticed what Emma indicated, the subtle variation in how light reflected off that particular edge of the display case. Victor crouched beside them, examining the seal with trained eyes that had learned to spot security weaknesses in facilities far more sophisticated than museums. Someone had accessed this case recently, the molecular adhesive used for climate sealing still showing microscopic irregularities that suggested disturbance within the past hour. He looked at Emma with newfound respect, understanding her observations transcended simple artistic talent into something approaching tactical awareness. Charles pulled out his phone to call security, but Victor's hand stopped him with gentle firmness, shaking his head in silent communication, that drawing attention now might endanger rather than help. The security chief's voice crackled over the PA system announcing systematic searches of all restricted areas, unknowingly broadcasting to whoever had taken the girl exactly where official resources were being deployed. Victor understood that whoever planned this operation would have accounted for standard security responses, making their small group's unorthodox approach potentially more effective than overwhelming force. Emma pointed not at the display case itself, but at the floor beneath it, where ventilation grates provided airflow to maintain environmental controls throughout the wing. The grate showed scuff marks invisible unless you were looking at child's eye level, fresh scratches in metal that suggested recent removal and replacement. Sophia knelt beside Emma, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed impossible. Surely no one could fit through ventilation systems. Surely this was architectural paranoia rather than actual escape route. Victor produced a multi-tool from his jacket pocket, with the casualness of someone who always carried such things, kneeling to examine the grate's fastening points, The screws had been loosened recently, turned just enough that someone could remove the grate quickly without tools, then replace it to avoid immediate detection. He looked up at Charles and Sophia, his expression conveying they'd found the path the missing girl had been taken, whether by force or deception through spaces designed for airflow rather than human passage. The ventilation shaft beyond the grate descended at a gentle angle toward the museum's lower levels, wide enough for a small adult or child to navigate if they knew where they were going. Emma's drawing suddenly made more sense. The man with the security badge had chosen someone petite specifically for this operation, perhaps lured Charles's daughter with a story about her father needing her for something. Victor remembered the staff-only door Emma had sketched slightly ajar, understanding now it had been staging ground rather than escape route. Sophia's hands trembled as she helped Victor remove the grate, the metal lifting away with barely a whisper to reveal darkness beyond that smelled of old stone and circulated air. Charles stared into that opening with the expression of someone watching his worst nightmares made tangible, his daughter somewhere in that darkness with people who'd planned this with meticulous care. Victor pulled a small flashlight from another pocket, the beam cutting through shadow to reveal metal walls extending downward beyond immediate sight. Emma crouched at the ventilation shaft's entrance, peering into darkness without the fear most children would display in similar circumstances. She pointed into the shaft, her voice matter-of-fact as she described seeing the man with the security badge checking his watch near this display case earlier, though she hadn't understood the significance until now. Her observations were assembling into narrative, individual puzzle pieces forming picture that the adults were finally beginning to see through her eyes. Victor made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone operating by official protocols, lowering himself into the ventilation shaft with the confidence of someone who'd navigated worse spaces in darker circumstances. Charles started to follow immediately, but Sophia grabbed his arm, whispering urgently that he'd do his daughter no good if he got stuck or injured in tight spaces. The logic penetrated his panic, and he nodded reluctantly, accepting he had to trust this stranger who moved through crisis like water finding its level. Sophia looked down at Emma, then at the shaft, then back at the girl's serious face, understanding that she couldn't send a child into potential danger no matter how valuable her observations had proven. Emma seemed to read this decision and nodded, content to have helped this far, her role as witness rather than participant clear in her acceptance. Victor's flashlight beam swept through the shaft, revealing it opened into a larger maintenance corridor about 20 feet below, accessible to someone who knew the museum's infrastructure. The security chief's voice echoed through the wing, announcing all public areas had been cleared, and they were beginning systematic searches of storage and maintenance sections. Victor heard boots approaching, and made split-second calculation about whether to involve official security or continue alone with information they'd discount coming from a child's drawings. He decided on compromise, pulling himself back out of the shaft and turning to Charles with instructions delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Within minutes, the security chief arrived with 2 guards, his skepticism visible until he saw the removed grate and Victor's matter-of-fact explanation about ventilation access to lower levels. Emma's drawings provided evidence that couldn't be dismissed, the detailed portrait of the traitorous guard and her careful observation of architectural details giving credibility to what would otherwise sound like desperate speculation. The security chief radioed for blueprints of the museum's infrastructure, his tactical mind already calculating insertion points and potential exits from the maintenance level. Victor watched professionals take over with mixed feelings, knowing they'd bring resources but also predictability that whoever planned this would anticipate. He caught Sophia's eye and saw similar concern reflected there, her protective instincts for Emma warring with understanding that they'd found what official searches had missed. Charles stood frozen between hope and terror, his daughter somewhere below them in darkness with people whose motives remained unclear, but whose planning suggested this went beyond simple kidnapping for ransom. Emma tugged Sophia's hand again, directing her attention not to the ventilation shaft, but to her sketch pad, flipping to another drawing the adults hadn't examined yet. This one showed the museum's exterior from an angle that suggested she'd drawn it from memory rather than direct observation, her artistic mind cataloging the building's structure during previous visits. She'd marked 3 points on the exterior walls with small X marks, locations that meant nothing to Sophia, but made Victor's expression sharpen with recognition. The 3 marks corresponded to emergency egress points required by fire codes, exits that connected to the maintenance level where ventilation ultimately led. Victor pulled out his phone and pulled up architectural records he'd accessed earlier when first assessing the museum's security, comparing Emma's drawing to official blueprints with growing certainty. The girl had identified the 3 locations where someone could exit the maintenance system directly to the exterior without passing through public areas or triggering standard security monitoring. Sophia realized with dawning horror that Emma's artistic talent masked something more profound. The girl processed spatial relationships and structural systems with the capability of trained architects or engineers. She'd mapped the museum's bones through observation and intuition, creating tactical intelligence disguised as children's artwork. Victor showed Emma's drawing to the security chief, whose expression shifted from skepticism to grim acknowledgement as he recognized the accuracy of her architectural rendering and the implications of those marked exit points. The security chief immediately deployed guards to cover all 3 egress points from the exterior, but Victor knew the advantage was already lost. Minutes had passed since the girl was taken. More than enough time to exit the building if that had been the plan. He studied Emma's drawings again, looking for details he'd missed, anything that might indicate whether this was extraction to external vehicles or something more complex happening within the museum's infrastructure itself. Charles found his voice again, demanding to know why anyone would take his daughter through maintenance corridors instead of simply walking out during the gala's early chaos before lockdown was implemented. Victor didn't answer immediately, his mind working through scenarios that ranged from ransom to revenge to something more strategic involving Charles's political connections and business dealings. The truth was he didn't know the endgame yet, only that the planning involved suggested this wasn't opportunistic, but rather carefully orchestrated weeks in advance. Emma pointed at her drawing of the man with the security badge again, her finger tapping a detail near his collar that the adults had overlooked in earlier examination. She'd drawn a small pin there, barely visible in the charcoal rendering, shaped like something that might have been a corporate logo or organizational symbol. Victor leaned closer, trying to make out the shape, while Sophia asked Emma if she could draw it larger, isolated from the portrait, to show what she'd observed more clearly. Emma flipped to a blank page and began sketching with focused intensity, her charcoal moving in precise strokes that gradually revealed the pin's design, a geometric pattern that combined angular lines with curves suggesting both modern design and classical symbolism. Victor's expression went carefully blank as he recognized the symbol, his mind racing through implications he couldn't voice in present company. Sophia watched his reaction, understanding without explanation that this detail meant something significant, connecting dots between the kidnapping and larger contexts none of them had considered. The security chief studied the isolated drawing of the pin, pulling out his phone to run image recognition through law enforcement databases, while his radio crackled with updates from guards searching the maintenance level. Victor knew what the search would reveal before results came back. The symbol belonged to a collective that existed in spaces between legitimate business and organized crime, brokers who facilitated transactions that required discretion and absolute reliability. Charles's daughter wasn't taken for ransom, but as leverage in some negotiation the father either knew about or had stumbled into unknowingly. Sophia kept Emma close as the adults exchanged looks weighted with information they couldn't articulate in front of a child, her protective instincts screaming to remove the girl from this situation, even as logic said they'd need her observations to navigate what came next. Emma seemed unaffected by the tension, simply waiting for them to understand what she'd shown them, her role as messenger rather than participant giving her strange immunity to the fear that paralyzed the adults. Charles stared at the drawing of the pin, something in the design triggering memory he couldn't quite access, association buried under years of business dealings and political compromises. Victor made a decision that went against every instinct about operational security, turning to Charles and asking directly what negotiations or deals he'd been involved in that might make his daughter valuable as leverage rather than ransom. The other man bristled at the implication he'd somehow caused this situation, but Victor's expression remained impassive, simply waiting for information necessary to navigate the crisis. The security chief seconded the question, his military background recognizing that tactical responses required understanding motivations and objectives beyond immediate rescue. Charles's resistance crumbled under the weight of his daughter's danger, and he began speaking in rapid fragments about a development deal involving waterfront property that had attracted interest from multiple parties. One group had approached him with terms that seemed too favorable, requesting he delay signing with competitors for 30 days while they assembled financing. He'd agreed casually, not thinking much about it, but now in the harsh light of crisis, he recognized the delay tactic for what it was. Time to arrange leverage if he didn't cooperate when their true offer came forward. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, as Victor understood this wasn't about the daughter at all, but about the property, and whatever strategic value it held for parties willing to orchestrate elaborate kidnapping to secure negotiating position. Sophia's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder, understanding they'd stumbled into commercial warfare conducted with tactics that belonged to different era and different world than museum galas and charity events. The girl who'd been taken was simply human collateral in a business transaction, her safety contingent on her father's willingness to sign documents that had nothing to do with parental love and everything to do with strategic real estate. Emma tugged Sophia's hand again, pointing not at her drawings but toward the ventilation shaft, then at her wristwatch with its cartoon character face showing time approaching 10:30. The adults looked at her with confusion until she explained in her quiet voice that the man with the security badge had checked his watch 3 times at 7-minute intervals, the last time being at 9:43. Victor understood immediately. The man was monitoring a timeline, waiting for something scheduled to happen at a specific moment. If he'd checked his watch every 7 minutes, the next checkpoint would be 10:30 exactly, suggesting whatever came next was time-dependent. The security chief checked his own watch, calculating 12 minutes until the next checkpoint in whatever operation was unfolding beneath their feet. Victor grabbed the flashlight again and lowered himself into the ventilation shaft without discussion or permission, understanding that official protocols would take too long to coordinate action within that window. Charles started to follow, but the security chief held him back physically this time, recognizing that emotional fathers made poor tactical operators, and Victor's competence suggested military or intelligence background that made him better equipped for whatever came next. Sophia watched Victor disappear into the shaft with mixture of relief that someone capable was acting, and terror that they were trusting a stranger whose background and motivations remained completely opaque. Emma stood calmly beside her, showing no fear or concern, simply waiting to see what would happen next, with the patience of someone who'd learned early that adults controlled outcomes, while children could only observe. The security chief radioed his exterior teams, ordering them to prepare for potential exit at the 3 points Emma had identified, weapons ready, but instructions to avoid engagement that might endanger the hostage. Victor navigated the ventilation shaft with practiced efficiency, his body remembering movements from previous lives spent in tight spaces under hostile conditions. The shaft descended at an angle that required controlled sliding rather than climbing, his shoulders barely fitting through spaces designed for airflow rather than human transit. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of him, revealing joints and turns in the ductwork that would have been invisible without illumination, confirming his suspicion that whoever had taken Charles's daughter had navigated this path with prior knowledge of the infrastructure's layout. The shaft opened into a maintenance corridor exactly where Emma's observations had suggested, a concrete tunnel lined with pipes and electrical conduits that served the museum's operational needs invisible to public visitors. Victor dropped to the corridor floor in a crouch, his flashlight immediately extinguishing as he listened to the darkness around him for any sound of movement or voices. The air here smelled of old stone and metal, industrial rather than the climate-controlled atmosphere of the galleries above, and somewhere in that darkness was a 9-year-old girl whose only value to her captors was her father's signature on documents. Footsteps echoed from deeper in the maintenance corridor, deliberate rather than hurried, suggesting confidence rather than flight. Victor moved toward the sound with the silence of someone who'd learned to walk without betraying his presence, each step placed with conscious precision on concrete that might otherwise telegraph his approach. His mind catalogued potential weapons in the environment, pipes that could be torn from their moorings, tools likely stored in utility closets, simple physics of confined spaces where trained fighters held advantages over those relying on intimidation rather than skill. The footsteps stopped, replaced by voices pitched low enough that words were indistinct, but tone suggested negotiation rather than distress. Victor edged closer, using pipe shadows and support columns for concealment, while the voices resolved into 2 speakers, a man he assumed was the traitorous guard, and someone else whose accent suggested Eastern European origin and bearing that came from military service. They were discussing timing, confirming extraction vehicles were positioned and ready, their conversation treating the girl as cargo to be delivered, rather than human being whose terror they might consider. Victor assessed the tactical situation with clinical precision, counting at least 2 hostiles in unknown space with potential for additional support, 1 hostage whose location and condition remained uncertain, and his own position as solo operator, without backup or communication to coordinate with security above. Standard procedure said wait for reinforcements, establish perimeter, negotiate from position of strength. But standard procedure assumed time they didn't have if Emma's observation about 7-minute checkpoints meant something was scheduled to happen at 10:30 that would move the girl beyond reach. He made the decision commanders make when calculations of risk weigh against certainty of loss if action is delayed, stepping out from behind his concealing column into the corridor with his flashlight aimed directly at the two men's faces. The sudden light blinded them temporarily, exactly as intended, while Victor's voice cut through their surprise with the calm authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. He informed them that the museum was in lockdown, all exits were covered, and their best option was to release the girl and negotiate their own safe departure, rather than adding kidnapping charges to whatever they'd been paid to attempt. The man with the security badge recovered first, his hand moving toward a weapon holster at his hip, while the other man shifted position to put himself between Victor and whatever lay deeper in the corridor. Victor remained motionless, his flashlight steady, calculating distances and angles while his voice continued in that same reasonable tone, explaining that violence wouldn't improve their situation, and intelligence suggested this was commercial leverage rather than personal grudge, meaning they were hired help rather than principals, and therefore expendable if complications arose. The words were designed to make them think about their own survival rather than their employer's objectives, inserting doubt into whatever instructions they'd received. A child's voice called out from deeper in the corridor, asking if her father was there, her tone confused rather than frightened, suggesting she'd been told some story about emergencies or surprises that required her cooperation. Victor felt something tighten in his chest at the innocent trust in that voice. Children's assumption that adults would protect them even when adults were the source of danger. He called back that her father was upstairs and she'd be seeing him soon. Everything was going to be fine, his voice gentler than the one he'd been using with her captors. The security badge man's hand completed its movement to his weapon, but Victor had already anticipated this decision, his flashlight shifting from blinding light to kinetic impact as he threw it at the man's face with precision that came from decades of training. The corridor exploded into confused motion as Victor closed the distance before the weapon could clear its holster, his forearm striking the other man's wrist with force calculated to numb rather than break, making the gun clatter to concrete while both of them grappled in darkness now that the flashlight had fallen. The Eastern European moved to assist his partner, but Victor used the confined space to his advantage, putting the security badge man between himself and the second attacker, while controlling the situation through leverage rather than strength. Years of jiu-jitsu and close-quarters combat had taught him that superior position mattered more than superior force, and in that moment his position was dominant, even if his situation remained precarious. The girl's voice called out again, more frightened now that she heard sounds of struggle, her child's mind beginning to understand that something was wrong with whatever story she'd been told. Sophia's voice echoed down the ventilation shaft, calling Victor's name with barely controlled panic, her protective instincts for Emma at odds with her responsibility to help find the missing girl. Victor couldn't respond without losing concentration on the two men he was controlling through physical dominance that required constant adjustment, but he kicked the fallen gun toward the shaft opening, sending it sliding across concrete away from anyone's immediate reach. The security badge man twisted in his grip, training evident in his counters, suggesting former military or police rather than simple hired muscle. Above in the manuscript wing, Emma stood at the ventilation shaft entrance with her sketchpad pressed against her chest, her expression serious as she listened to sounds echoing up from below. Sophia wanted to pull her away from the opening, shield her from whatever violence was happening in that darkness, but the girl seemed rooted in place with that same observational intensity she'd displayed all evening. The security chief was coordinating with his teams over the radio, while simultaneously monitoring the blueprints on his tablet, trying to determine alternate access points to the maintenance level that wouldn't require navigating the ventilation system. Charles paced like a caged animal, his composure completely shattered now that he'd heard his daughter's voice echoing up from below, so close, and yet separated by concrete and steel and men with weapons who'd taken her for leverage in business deals he barely remembered negotiating. Sophia made a decision that surprised her own cautious nature, sitting down at the ventilation shaft's edge and lowering herself into the opening before anyone could stop her. The security chief shouted protest, but she was already sliding down the angled duct, following the path Victor had taken minutes earlier, while her heart hammered against her ribs. Emma watched Sophia disappear into the shaft with approval in her eyes, something in the girl's expression suggesting she'd expected this choice, understood that some people couldn't stand safely above while others faced danger below. The security chief cursed creatively in at least 3 languages, his tactical plan dissolving as civilians threw themselves into the operation without coordination or communication. Charles demanded to follow as well, But this time 2 guards physically restrained him, their instructions clear that the hostage's father was absolutely the last person who should be involved in confrontation with his daughter's captors. Sophia emerged from the ventilation shaft into darkness, punctuated by sounds of struggle somewhere ahead in the maintenance corridor, her eyes adjusting slowly to the absence of light, while adrenaline sharpened her senses beyond their normal capacity. She called Victor's name again, louder this time, her voice carrying authority that came from years of managing chaotic classrooms and difficult situations with calm competence. The fighting sounds paused for a moment, Victor's voice responding with directions to stay back and keep talking so he could locate her position by sound rather than sight in the darkness. The girl's voice called out from somewhere to Sophia's left, asking who was there and whether her father had sent them, her tone shifting toward real fear, as she began to understand this wasn't the emergency surprise she'd been told about. Sophia responded with gentle reassurance, introducing herself and explaining that yes, her father was upstairs, and they were going to take her home very soon. Everything was going to be fine, even though it seemed scary right now. She kept talking in that calm educator's voice while feeling her way along the wall toward where the child's voice originated, her hands encountering pipes and rough concrete. Victor had the security badge man controlled in a joint lock that kept him immobile without breaking anything, while the Eastern European had retreated several feet after receiving an elbow to his solar plexus that had temporarily taken the fight out of him. The arrival of Sophia's voice complicated his tactical situation. Another civilian to protect, someone without training or experience in these circumstances who could become liability or hostage, depending on how the situation evolved. But her steady voice also provided psychological advantage, the child responding to female reassurance more readily than she might to a strange man's promises. The maintenance corridor's darkness was absolute now that the flashlight lay somewhere on the floor, its beam pointing at nothing useful, while the 4 adults and 1 child navigated by sound and touch. Sophia reached a utility closet where Charles's daughter had been placed with instructions to wait, the girl sitting on empty paint cans with her arms wrapped around her knees. Sophia knelt beside her, gathering her into a hug that was as much to steady her own trembling as to comfort the child, whispering soothing nonsense while her mind raced through options for getting them both back to safety. The Eastern European had recovered enough to retrieve the gun Victor had kicked away, but rather than engaging, he was backing toward what sounded like a door or exit deeper in the corridor. Victor made split-second calculation about whether to pursue or prioritize securing the hostage, his training screaming to neutralize all threats, but his instincts recognizing that the girl's safety mattered more than capturing hired help. He released the security badge man with a final strike that would keep him dazed for several minutes, then called out directions to Sophia about navigating back toward the ventilation shaft. Sophia scooped up Charles's daughter with determination that surprised her own perception of her capabilities, the girl's weight manageable even as she navigated darkness, while Victor's voice guided her toward the shaft opening. The child clung to her with desperate trust, crying now that the fear she'd been suppressing finally found release. Behind them, the Eastern European had apparently decided discretion was wiser than confrontation. The sound of a door opening and closing suggesting he'd taken an emergency exit, rather than face whatever complications remained in the corridor. Victor found his flashlight by touch, the metal still warm from the impact he'd delivered to the security badge man's face. The beam revealed the traitorous guard unconscious against a wall, blood from his nose staining the concrete where he'd fallen. Victor checked quickly that the man would survive his injuries, then moved to where Sophia struggled with the girl's weight, taking the child from her with gentle efficiency despite the violence his hands had delivered moments before. Together they navigated back toward the shaft opening, Victor's flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed less absolute now that resolution was approaching. The security chief's voice called down through the ventilation shaft, demanding status report with barely controlled urgency. Victor responded that the hostage was secure, and they were returning, 1 hostile unconscious in the corridor, and 1 fled through emergency exit, requesting medical personnel be standing by for the child's evaluation. Above them, Charles's voice broke with relief and desperate need to see his daughter, his earlier composure impossible to maintain now that the worst moments were transitioning toward resolution. Emma watched from the manuscript wing as Victor appeared first through the ventilation shaft opening, lifting Charles's daughter up to waiting guards who passed her immediately to paramedics who'd been standing by. The girl was crying but unhurt, her trauma psychological rather than physical, and Charles swept her into his arms with a desperation that transcended his usual controlled public persona. Sophia emerged next, helped out by the security chief who'd apparently forgiven her reckless choice to descend without authorization, her clothes dusty and her hands scraped, but her expression serene with the satisfaction of action taken rather than safety maintained. Victor climbed out last, his suit ruined and his knuckles showing evidence of the brief violence below, but his face wearing the neutral expression of someone who'd done what needed doing without particular pride or regret. Emma approached him with her sketch pad, flipping to a blank page and holding it out with a charcoal pencil as though requesting an autograph. He looked at her with something approaching respect, understanding passing between them that transcended the decades separating their ages, and he took the pencil to sketch something quickly before handing it back. Sophia peered over Emma's shoulder at what Victor had drawn, a simple but recognizable portrait of the girl, her observational skills captured in the precise lines and shading that suggested he too had been trained to record details through artistic rendering. Emma studied the drawing with serious concentration, then nodded once as though confirming some private assessment, tucking the sketchpad against her chest with satisfied finality. The security chief was already coordinating with police who'd been called once the hostage was recovered, preparing for the interviews and investigations that would follow. Charles held his daughter while paramedics checked her vital signs and assessed her emotional state, his attention entirely consumed by her presence and the reassurance that she was safe despite the terror of the past hours. Sophia stood nearby, ready to provide support if needed, her educator's training giving her tools to help the girl process what had happened, once immediate crisis subsided. Victor spoke quietly with the security chief, providing details about the hostel remaining unconscious below and the one who'd fled through emergency exit, his tactical debrief efficient and professional. Emma sat down against a display case, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline of observation and alertness was fading into the background. Sophia noticed and sat beside her, gathering the girl into her side with an arm around her shoulders that conveyed both gratitude and protection. The manuscript wing had transformed from crime scene to resolution, the climate control humming its steady reassurance while the humans within its space began processing what had happened and what came next. The museum director appeared with legal counsel and insurance representatives, his concern about the institution's liability visible despite his relief that the situation had been resolved without worse outcome. The gala guests were being released from lockdown after giving statements to police, their evening of charity transformed into story they'd tell at dinner parties for years. Victor accepted a bottle of water from someone and drank deeply, his body beginning to register the exertion of the past hour now that immediate action had concluded. Charles finally looked up from his daughter to where Victor stood, approaching him with the intention of offering thanks that Victor waved away before words could form. The two men studied each other with new understanding, the crisis having stripped away social pretense to reveal capabilities and character that normal circumstances kept hidden. Charles extended his hand, and Victor took it, a handshake that conveyed respect and recognition between men who'd never move in the same circles, but who'd shared something profound in the darkness below the museum's elegant facade. Sophia met Victor's eyes across the space, something passing between them that went beyond the immediate situation, a recognition of competence and courage that mirrored each other despite their vastly different backgrounds. Emma watched this exchange with her usual observational intensity, already cataloging the moment in whatever way her artistic mind processed human interaction. The night had transformed all of them, connections forged in crisis that would persist beyond whatever investigation and aftermath followed in the days ahead. Police investigators arrived within 20 minutes, their questions methodical as they documented every detail from the ventilation shaft to the maintenance corridor where the security badge man still lay unconscious. Detective Sarah Chen took lead on the interrogation, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she assessed the assembled group and immediately identified Victor as someone whose background deserved closer examination. He answered her questions with precise economy, providing facts without elaboration, his demeanor suggesting familiarity with law enforcement protocols that came from experience on one side of the investigation or another. Emma sat with Sophia in a quiet corner, paramedics having cleared her for release since she'd never been in direct danger, just an observer whose drawings had cracked the case open. The girl sketched idly while adults talked around her, capturing faces of the police officers and detectives with the same careful attention she'd given the gala guests hours earlier. One drawing showed Detective Chen in profile, the set of her jaw, and the way she held her pen revealing personality through gesture that most people would never consciously notice, but Emma's pencil captured automatically. Charles refused to leave the museum until his daughter had been fully examined and cleared by pediatric specialists the hospital had sent over, his protective instincts now hyperactive after the terror of nearly losing her. She clung to him with exhaustion, replacing fear, asking questions about what had happened, and why the nice security man had told her there was a special surprise in the basement. Sophia sat nearby, offering gentle guidance about how to answer those questions honestly without traumatizing the child further. Her educator's training proving valuable in this moment of delicate psychological navigation. Victor stood apart from the main group, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low tones to someone on the other end. The security chief watched him with professional interest, recognizing the bearing and tactical competence that suggested military intelligence or specialized law enforcement background. When the call ended, Victor approached the chief and handed him a business card that contained only a name and phone number, no company affiliation or title to suggest what legitimate enterprise he might represent in daylight hours. The card read simply, Victor Marchesi, with a number the security chief recognized as having a prefix used by certain government contractors and private security firms that operated in gray spaces between official and unofficial. He pocketed it without comment, understanding that some questions were better left unasked when the results spoke for themselves. Victor had recovered the hostage without casualties and neutralized threats with surgical precision, making him either extremely well-trained or extremely experienced, possibly both. Detective Chen circled back to Emma, crouching beside her with the careful approach of someone who understood children required different interview techniques than adults. She asked permission to see the drawings, her tone respectful rather than demanding, treating the 8-year-old as a credible witness rather than a child whose observations might be dismissed. Emma handed over her sketch pad with quiet pride, understanding that her art had mattered in ways that transcended the usual adult praise for children's creative efforts. The detective studied each drawing with growing admiration, pausing particularly long on the detailed portrait of the traitorous guard and the isolated sketch of the organizational pin he'd worn. She photographed both with her phone, sending them to forensics and intelligence teams who could run the images through databases that might identify the criminal network behind the attempted kidnapping. Emma watched this process with satisfaction, seeing her observations transform into evidence that would have consequences beyond the immediate rescue. Sophia noticed Victor preparing to leave. His role in the crisis concluded, and his presence no longer required for the official investigation that would follow. She stood and approached him, her movement drawing his attention, and his slight nod acknowledging her approach. They hadn't really spoken since emerging from the maintenance corridor, the chaos of police arrival and medical evaluation consuming everyone's attention, but something in their shared experience demanded acknowledgement before he disappeared back into whatever world he normally inhabited. Their conversation was brief, conducted in voices too low for others to overhear, but the quality of their attention to each other suggested depth beyond simple gratitude for assistance rendered. Victor asked about the educational program that had brought Emma to the museum, his questions specific enough to reveal genuine interest rather than polite small talk. Sophia explained her work with at-risk children and the power of art to give them tools for processing trauma and expressing observations they couldn't articulate verbally. Victor listened with focus that made Sophia understand he heard not just her words, but their implications, recognizing that Emma's unusual observational skills likely stemmed from early life experiences that had taught her survival, required noticing what others missed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a check already written, folding it once, and pressing it into Sophia's hand with quiet insistence when she started to refuse. The amount would fund her program for a full year, removing financial stress and allowing expansion to serve more children like Emma. Sophia's protest died as she met his eyes and saw something there that suggested this wasn't charity, but investment in a resource he recognized as valuable beyond measure. Emma's drawings had saved a life tonight, her careful attention to detail providing intelligence that trained security had missed. Victor understood that talent like hers needed nurturing, and the educational program gave her tools to channel observation into art rather than letting trauma calcify into something darker. Charles approached with his daughter in his arms, the girl half asleep against his shoulder, but still awake enough to see the adults gathering near Emma. He'd overheard enough of Victor and Sophia's conversation to understand the financial support being offered, and he added his own commitment to match whatever funding Victor provided. The manuscript wing had become impromptu boardroom, 3 people from completely different worlds united by crisis, into supporting a program that gave vulnerable children access to beauty and expression. Emma looked up from her drawing as the adults discussed her program's future, her serious expression suggesting she understood more than they might expect about what was being decided. Sophia crouched beside her and explained that her drawings had been so important tonight that people wanted to help more children learn to see and create the way she did. The girl nodded slowly, processing this information with the same careful attention she gave everything else, then returned to her sketch without comment. Detective Chen finished her preliminary interviews and began coordinating with the officers who'd taken the unconscious guard into custody, his awakening in handcuffs marking the beginning of interrogation that would unravel the network behind the kidnapping attempt. The Eastern European who'd fled remained at large, but his image had been captured on security footage and distributed to agencies that specialized in tracking international operatives. The night's events would have consequences reaching far beyond this museum, connections being traced and networks being mapped by investigators who understood this was symptom of larger criminal infrastructure. Victor's daughter appeared with one of the museum coordinators who'd been watching her during the crisis, her worried face brightening when she saw her father unharmed, despite his disheveled appearance. He gathered her close, explaining in simplified terms that there had been an emergency, but everyone was safe now, and they'd be going home soon. She accepted this with the trust children place in parents they believe capable of handling any situation, her world still secure despite the undercurrents of violence that had swirled around the gala. Sophia watched Victor with his daughter, and saw the gentleness there that contradicted the controlled violence he displayed in the maintenance corridor. Understanding that people contained multitudes, and the capacity for protection often lived alongside capacity for harm. Emma watched too, her artist's eye cataloging the relationship between father and daughter, the way his entire posture softened when he held her. She turned to a fresh page and began sketching them, capturing something essential about the bond that transcended the evening's chaos. The museum director announced that the gala was officially concluded, and transportation had been arranged for those guests who'd been detained during the lockdown investigation. The crowd began dispersing, people processing the evening's excitement with reactions ranging from outrage at the inconvenience to thrilled storytelling about being present during a real kidnapping crisis. Charles remained behind with his daughter, unwilling to leave until police confirmed they had no further immediate questions, his protective presence now permanent fixture until he could get her home and begin processing what had happened. Sophia gathered Emma's belongings, preparing to escort her back to the group home where she lived with other children in foster care awaiting permanent placement. Victor noticed this preparation and approached again, asking quietly about Emma's situation and whether permanent adoption was possible or if bureaucratic complications prevented it. Sophia explained the complexity of the foster system, the background checks and home studies required, the preference for two-parent households that made single adoption more difficult. Victor listened without interrupting, his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind his careful facade, but something in his attention suggested calculation rather than idle curiosity. He thanked Sophia for her explanation and turned to Emma, crouching to her level, and telling her that her drawings had been the most important contribution to solving tonight's crisis. She met his eyes with that serious, knowing gaze and simply nodded, understanding that he meant this as truth rather than patronizing praise adults sometimes offered children. The manuscript wing slowly emptied as police completed their evidence collection and began removing barriers that had transformed the space into crime scene. The climate control continued its steady hum, indifferent to human drama, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for documents that had survived centuries and would outlast everyone present tonight. Sophia felt exhaustion settling over her as adrenaline finally metabolized, leaving behind the shaky awareness of how differently the evening could have ended. 3 days after the gala, Detective Chen requested a meeting with Victor at a downtown cafe that catered to business people seeking privacy for sensitive discussions. He arrived exactly on time, his appearance now polished and professional without the dishevelment of crisis, though his eyes carried the same watchful quality that never fully relaxed. Chen had spent those 3 days investigating not just the kidnapping, but Victor himself, discovering layers of corporate legitimacy that didn't quite conceal the interesting gaps in his documented history and the connections to individuals whose backgrounds suggested worlds beyond business deals and legitimate enterprise. She opened a folder containing the results of her investigation into the organizational pin Emma had drawn, the symbol belonging to a network that facilitated high-stakes negotiations through means that existed in legal gray areas. The group specialized in creating leverage where none existed naturally, their services expensive, and their methods sophisticated enough to avoid prosecution, despite law enforcement's awareness of their activities. Charles Hammond's development deal had attracted their attention because the waterfront property involved held strategic value for shipping routes that legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises both wanted to control. Victor listened without surprise, confirming Chen's suspicion that he'd recognized the symbol immediately when Emma had drawn it. She asked directly what his connection was to these networks and why someone with his apparent resources and capabilities had been attending a charity gala, rather than operating in the shadows where his skills would be more typically employed. His answer was measured, explaining that his daughter's desire to see the museum's medieval manuscripts had been genuine, his presence simply a father indulging his child's interests while maintaining awareness of the various players who moved through elite social spaces. Chen wasn't entirely satisfied with this explanation, but recognized she lacked evidence to push harder, and ultimately Victor had prevented a crime rather than committed one. She shifted focus to the traitorous guard, whose interrogation had revealed he'd been recruited specifically for this operation 6 months earlier, his entire employment at the museum part of an elaborate setup that demonstrated the kidnapping had been planned with meticulous patience. The man had cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, providing details about the network's structure that would lead to additional arrests. The Eastern European who'd fled remained unidentified despite their best efforts, his face not matching any databases and his DNA from blood samples at the scene revealing only that he'd never been arrested or processed through any system law enforcement could access. Victor suggested, with the careful phrasing of someone offering hypothetical speculation rather than concrete intelligence, that the man was likely private military contractor from former Soviet states, where documentation and identification were commodities that could be purchased or erased depending on need and resources. Detective Chen closed her folder and studied Victor across the table, her detective's instincts telling her this man represented complexities she couldn't fully unravel without resources and time her department wouldn't authorize. She settled for extracting a promise that if he encountered the network again through his business dealings, he would share information with law enforcement rather than taking unilateral action. Victor agreed with the slight smile of someone who understood they were both pretending this promise carried weight, while knowing he'd do whatever he deemed necessary if circumstances demanded it. The conversation shifted to Emma, Chen's expression softening as she described the girl's statement to child psychologists who'd evaluated her after the crisis. Emma had processed the evening's events with remarkable resilience, her artistic outlet providing therapeutic value that professional intervention supplemented rather than replaced. The detective mentioned that Emma's drawings were being used as training materials for law enforcement, teaching officers to value observational skills that witnesses of all ages might possess if investigators knew to ask the right questions. Victor asked about Emma's current situation and whether the foster system had moved toward permanent placement, his interest evident, despite his attempt at casual inquiry. Chen explained that Sophia's educational program had become Emma's primary support network, the girl spending most afternoons at the museum even outside official program hours. Sophia had reportedly inquired about becoming Emma's foster parent, but the process required extensive evaluation, and the bureaucracy moved with frustrating slowness when dealing with single adults seeking to adopt older children. The detective watched Victor's reaction to this information, noting the calculation in his expression that suggested wheels turning behind his careful facade. She'd done enough background investigation to know he had resources and connections that could accelerate bureaucratic processes if he chose to employ them, but she couldn't determine his motivation for potential involvement in Emma's placement. Their meeting concluded with mutual understanding that they'd likely cross paths again given the networks he moved through and the cases she investigated, an acknowledgement that their interests aligned even if their methods differed. Victor left the cafe and made 3 phone calls before reaching his car, setting in motion inquiries that would map the foster care system's requirements and identify pressure points where appropriate influence could expedite Emma's placement with Sophia. He wasn't entirely certain why this mattered to him beyond professional respect for the girl's observational skills and recognition that talent like hers needed nurturing. Perhaps it was seeing his own daughter's innocence contrasted against Emma's too serious watchfulness, understanding that childhood should contain space for wonder rather than survival. Sophia received a call that afternoon from a social worker she'd never spoken with before, explaining that Emma's case had been flagged for expedited review and asking if Sophia remained interested in pursuing foster placement with potential path to adoption. The questions that followed were standard but delivered with urgency that suggested someone with influence had intervened to move Emma's file from the massive backlog where it had languished. Sophia answered honestly about her financial situation, her single status, and her commitment to providing stable home environment, despite not fitting the traditional family structure. The social worker scheduled a home visit for the following week, explaining that if the initial evaluation went well, Emma could potentially be placed with Sophia within a month, rather than the typical 6 to 12-month timeline. Sophia ended the call with a mixture of hope and confusion, wondering what had triggered this sudden acceleration. She thought of Victor's check still sitting in her program's account, the funding that had removed immediate financial pressure and demonstrated stability that bureaucratic evaluations valued. Emma arrived for her usual afternoon at the museum, finding Sophia with paperwork spread across her desk and an expression that telegraphed something significant had happened. The girl set down her sketch pad and waited with characteristic patience for the adult to find words to explain. Sophia knelt beside her and spoke carefully about the possibility of Emma coming to live with her permanently, explaining the process and timeline while watching the girl's face for reaction that would indicate her feelings about this potential change. Emma's expression remained serious as she processed this information, her mind visibly working through implications and possibilities that most 8-year-olds wouldn't consider. She asked practical questions about where she would sleep and whether she could still attend the museum program, concerns about logistics rather than emotional response to the concept of permanent placement. Sophia answered each question honestly, understanding that Emma's foster care experience had taught her to manage expectations and avoid hoping for stability that might not materialize. The girl finally nodded slowly and returned to her drawing. The conversation apparently concluded as far as she was concerned. Sophia recognized this as Emma's way of accepting the information without investing emotional energy until the situation became concrete reality. She returned to her paperwork while Emma sketched, the comfortable silence between them, feeling like preview of what their permanent arrangement might resemble. Two people who understood each other's need for quiet space and creative expression. Charles Hammond visited the museum later that week, bringing his daughter to see the medieval manuscripts she'd been admiring when she disappeared. The girl was recovering well under professional therapeutic support, her resilience aided by her father's unwavering presence and the knowledge that she was safe. He sought out Sophia to discuss additional funding for the educational program, his gratitude for Emma's role in his daughter's rescue expressed through financial commitment rather than mere words. Their conversation revealed that Charles had also received mysterious acceleration in various business dealings that had been stalled by bureaucratic complications, permits suddenly approved, and regulatory reviews expedited in ways that suggested influential intervention. He strongly suspected Victor's involvement, but had no evidence beyond circumstantial timing and the kind of results that required connections operating beyond normal channels. Sophia shared her own experience with Emma's foster case being fast-tracked, and they exchanged knowing looks that acknowledged forces moving behind scenes while remaining officially invisible. Emma appeared beside them, carrying a new drawing, this one showing the museum's facade with Sophia standing at the entrance, and Emma beside her, a simple illustration that captured the girl's hope for stability, even as she maintained emotional distance from its certainty. Charles studied the drawing and offered to fund the legal expenses for Sophia's foster application and potential adoption, understanding that bureaucratic acceleration removed some barriers, but financial support removed others. Sophia accepted with gratitude that bordered on overwhelm, the convergence of resources and support, transforming what had seemed impossible into achievable reality. Victor arrived unexpectedly later that afternoon with his daughter, the girl having requested to return to see the manuscripts that had been interrupted by the gala's crisis. He found Sophia in the educational program space with Emma, the two of them organizing art supplies while discussing color theory with depth that suggested Sophia taught not just technique, but conceptual understanding. His daughter immediately gravitated to Emma's sketch pad, admiring the drawings with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized talent beyond her own capabilities. The four of them spent an hour in the manuscript wing, Victor and Sophia maintaining careful distance while their daughters bonded over illuminated letters and gold leaf decoration techniques that medieval monks had perfected. The adults spoke occasionally, their conversation touching on practical matters like Emma's placement timeline and the program's expansion plans, but beneath the mundane topics ran undercurrent of mutual respect and attraction neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The moment felt suspended in possibility, futures branching from present decisions not yet made. 2 months after the gala, Sophia signed final paperwork, making Emma's placement with her official, the foster arrangement established with unusual efficiency that still carried Victor's fingerprints, despite his careful distance from the official process. Emma moved her few belongings into Sophia's apartment, With the practiced efficiency of someone who'd changed homes multiple times, her emotional investment carefully managed, even as hope began cautiously emerging. The spare bedroom Sophia had prepared contained a desk positioned near the window for optimal natural light, understanding that Emma's art required space and illumination to flourish. The museum's educational program expanded into additional rooms made available through Charles Hammond's intervention with the board of directors, his influence ensuring that Sophia's vision for accessible art education received institutional support beyond simple funding. More children from foster care and underserved communities began attending, Emma's success story inspiring Sophia to reach wider, while maintaining the personal attention that made each child feel seen. Emma herself had become unofficial assistant, her observational skills helping identify which new students needed extra encouragement and which flourished with independence. Victor maintained peripheral presence in their lives, his daughter's friendship with Emma providing natural excuse for occasional museum visits that felt less contrived than direct contact with Sophia might have appeared. The adults circled each other with careful choreography, their attraction evident, but complicated by the vast differences in their worlds, and the unspoken acknowledgement that Victor's background included elements that didn't bear close examination. Sophia knew enough not to ask direct questions about his business interests, while Victor respected her choice to build life in legitimate spaces, untainted by the gray areas where he operated. Detective Chen closed the investigation into the kidnapping attempt after securing convictions for the traitorous guard and 3 other network members who'd been identified through his cooperation. The Eastern European remained at large, his identity still mysterious despite months of investigation. But the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the network's operations in the city had been disrupted sufficiently to deter future attempts. She sent Sophia a note commending Emma's observational contributions and suggesting the girl might consider law enforcement career when she was older, recognition that felt both validating and slightly amusing, given Emma's quiet nature. The waterfront development that had triggered the kidnapping attempt eventually proceeded under Charles Hammond's leadership, though with additional security measures and background investigations that revealed several other potential infiltrators in his organization. The experience had made him paranoid about vetting personnel, but it had also made him more conscious of how wealth and power created vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance. His daughter recovered fully from her ordeal, her resilience aided by her father's transparent processing of his own fear, and the knowledge that people like Emma and Sophia existed in the world as protectors, rather than threats. Emma's art evolved over those months, her portraits gaining depth and emotional resonance that transcended simple technical skill. She began a series depicting moments from the gala night, processing the trauma through creative expression in ways that therapy had facilitated, but not fully resolved. One drawing showed the moment Victor had emerged from the ventilation shaft, carrying Charles's daughter to safety, the composition capturing heroism without glorifying violence. Another depicted Sophia sitting beside her in the manuscript wing's aftermath, protective presence rendered in careful charcoal that made the viewer feel the comfort Emma had drawn from that moment. Sophia framed several of Emma's drawings and displayed them in the educational program space, not as decoration, but as teaching tools showing students what observational art could achieve. The portrait of the traitorous guard became particularly famous within law enforcement circles, used in training materials about the importance of witness observation regardless of age. Emma accepted this attention with characteristic equanimity, understanding her drawings had mattered, but not allowing that importance to inflate her sense of self beyond healthy boundaries. Victor's business dealings gradually shifted toward more legitimate enterprise, his daughter's presence in his life creating motivation to reduce involvement in gray areas that might eventually expose her to danger. He maintained enough connections to remain informed about the networks he'd once moved through more actively, positioning himself as information broker rather than active participant. This transformation was subtle rather than dramatic, a slow pivot that Sophia recognized even without full understanding of what he was pivoting away from, toward something resembling normal life. The museum held another gala 6 months after the kidnapping, this one proceeding without incident, though, with significantly enhanced security protocols that included extensive background investigations and real-time monitoring systems. Sophia attended as official guest rather than staff member, her program's success having elevated her status within the institution. Victor appeared with his daughter, and they navigated the evening with careful awareness of how different this experience was from the last time they'd stood in these galleries surrounded by art and affluence. Emma stayed home by choice, preferring quiet evening with a new set of professional-grade drawing pencils Victor had gifted her to the chaos of crowds and formal clothing. Sophia had been worried about leaving her alone so soon after placement, but Emma had assured her with characteristic seriousness that she was fine. She simply preferred to draw. The girl's comfort with solitude was both reassuring evidence of her resilience and concerning reminder that she'd learned self-sufficiency too young out of necessity rather than healthy independence. The evening's formal programming concluded without drama, and Sophia found herself standing with Victor near the same display cases where Emma had first noticed the architectural details that led to the rescue. They spoke quietly about Emma's progress and the program's success, their conversation comfortable in the way that develops between people who've survived crisis together. When Victor suggested dinner sometime without the pretense of supervising their daughter's friendship, Sophia accepted with a smile that acknowledged they'd both been circling this possibility for months. Charles appeared with his daughter to say goodbye before departing, the girl having wanted to thank Sophia again for helping save her that night. The child's memory of the event had become healthily imprecise through therapeutic processing, the sharp edges of fear softened into narrative she could integrate without trauma. She hugged Sophia with uncomplicated affection before returning to her father's protective proximity. The bond between them strengthened rather than damaged by the crisis they'd weathered together. Detective Chen attended the gala as security consultant, her role having expanded beyond simple investigation into advisory capacity for institutions seeking to prevent similar incidents. She spoke briefly with Victor and Sophia, her expression suggesting she understood more about their developing relationship than they'd yet articulated to themselves. Her benediction came in the form of casual comment that good people deserved happiness regardless of complicated histories, a statement that applied equally to reformed criminals, protective educators, and observant children finding permanent homes. The evening ended with Sophia and Victor walking through the museum's sculpture garden, the November air sharp enough to justify standing close for warmth without requiring explanation. They discussed practical matters like Emma's upcoming school enrollment and Victor's daughter's interest in learning to draw from someone with real talent. But beneath the logistics ran deeper conversation about trust and transformation, about whether people could truly change their fundamental natures or simply learn to manage them toward better outcomes. Sophia asked directly about Victor's background, not for details he couldn't share, but for understanding of whether his past would endanger the present she was building with Emma. He answered with honesty that surprised them both, explaining that he'd spent years operating in spaces between legal and illegal, but had gradually recognized that his daughter deserved better than a father who might disappear into violence or prison. His transformation wasn't complete, and perhaps never would be, but trajectory mattered more than origin point, and he was committed to moving toward light, even if shadows remained part of his landscape. They stood near a bronze sculpture, depicting a figure caught mid-stride between two destinations, the symbolic resonance not lost on either of them. Sophia made decision that combined hope and risk in equal measure, taking Victor's hand and acknowledging that she understood what he was offering, and accepting it with eyes open to complications. Their first kiss happened in that sculpture garden, with the museum's lights dimming behind them, a moment of connection that felt both inevitable and impossible, ordinary and extraordinary, in the way that real transformation always does. Emma's latest drawing, completed that evening alone in Sophia's apartment, showed the museum's facade illuminated against night sky, with two figures walking in the sculpture garden and a girl watching from a window holding a sketchpad. The composition balanced light and shadow, presence and distance, connection and observation in ways that revealed Emma's understanding had evolved beyond simple recording of what she saw into interpretation of what moments meant. She titled it simply, Home, a word that carried weight she'd never previously been able to attach to any location or relationship. The drawing would eventually hang in the educational program's entrance, greeting students who arrived uncertain about whether art could matter in lives complicated by trauma and instability. Emma's story became quiet legend within the program, not dramatized into fairy tale, but presented as evidence that observation and expression could transform survival skills into talents that built bridges between worlds. The girl who'd drawn a kidnapper's face with charcoal had created something more profound than evidence. She'd created possibility. Years would pass before Emma fully processed how the gala night had changed her trajectory, connecting her not just with Sophia and stable home, but with understanding that her careful watching of the world held value beyond self-protection. Victor's daughter would become her closest friend, the two girls bonding over art, and shared understanding of fathers whose love came wrapped in complicated histories. Sophia and Victor would navigate their relationship's complexities with patience that came from both having learned that worthwhile things required effort and grace. But in that moment, 2 months after Emma had handed over a sketch pad that changed everything, the future remained unwritten potential rather than determined outcome. The museum stood in the November night, its collections preserved against time's passage while human dramas unfolded in its spaces. Somewhere in the building, a new child in the educational program was discovering that charcoal and paper could transform what they'd seen into what others needed to understand. The cycle continued, observation becoming art, becoming evidence, becoming change. One drawing at a time, building bridges between isolation and connection, survival and flourishing, watching and being seen. Thank you all for following this story to its conclusion. If you enjoyed Emma, Sophia, and Victor's journey from crisis to connection, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you across the world. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates stories about quiet courage and unexpected families. Your support makes it possible for me to keep bringing these narratives to life, and I'm grateful for every person who takes the time to engage with the work. Until the next story, keep watching for the details that matter.